The movie begins with a man named Joe walking up in an unfamiliar place. He begins to violently throw up, a clear sign that he'd been drugged and has no memories of how he ended up there. At first, Joe starts to panic and tries to call out for help, but after several minutes of screaming, he hears a man in the next room telling him to calm down. Joe doesn't get a chance to talk to the man, and he claims that it's time for him to go and repeatedly asks him to calm down. As the man leaves, Joe starts pacing around, trying to make sense of his surroundings when he hears a slot opening up. A bag of chips and a bottle of water get thrown inside for him, and Joe rushes toward the slot, begging whoever can hear him to let him out. Instead of helping him though, an automated voice on the other end tells him to back off. However, Joe refuses to back down and pleads to be let out, claiming that his wife is pregnant and he needs to be with her. All of a sudden, something hits his hand really hard and injures him. Still, Joe refuses to give up and starts to investigate. To his surprise, he discovers that the packet of chips is from Mullard, the company that he works for. Before he eats it, a loud alarm starts blaring before a projector turns on and an AI welcomes him to the mill. The mill is a training program to make employees the best versions of themselves. After this, a timer comes on and begins counting down the minutes. When Joe asks what the timer is for, his neighbor responds and tells him that it's counting down to midnight. Joe then asks him what happens at midnight, but his neighbor refuses to say anything and claims that he will have to see for himself. Just as he was about to ask more questions, he gets interrupted by his fellow prisoners, and Joe realizes that there are several people being trapped. Sometime later, he falls asleep, but gets woken up at midnight by the screaming of a man who begs for his life. His pleas go unanswered, and he's killed torturously slow. Joe then spends the night trying to fall asleep, and when he comes up the next morning, he resumes his exploration. This time, he discovers a skull from one of the prisoners. He asks his neighbor about it, who tells him that Mullard has mentioned this in the papers that all the employees were made to sign at the time of their hiring, but no one bothered to read through it. At this moment, the AI comes on again and informs Joe that he needs to push the mill in his room to meet the daily quota. An employee with the lowest number will be terminated, and his first quota was 50, which meant that he needed to push the mill at the very least 50 times. With no other choice left, Joe begins to push the mill, and by the end of the day, he manages to push it 100 times, surpassing his quota. He continues to do this for several days, and each day, one person with the lowest number of rotations gets terminated. Despite this fact, Joe manages to surpass each day's quota. One day, his neighbor tells him to stop treating the other employees like his friends because they will always try to outdo him. One particularly hot morning, Joe ends up drinking all the water that he has and asks for more. However, his neighbor tells him that Mullard only gives them enough water so that they will survive. He suggests filtering his urine and drinking it, but Joe refuses to do that. Angry, he starts pushing the mill as he gets visions of his wife Kate, who's pregnant. The two of them are then given a huge house by Mullard, and even though Kate was skeptical about accepting it, they end up deciding that it's the best thing to do for their unborn child. That day, Joe pushes the mill 370 times, because of which he received an engraved pen as a token of appreciation. This doesn't really sit well with him, and he begins shouting at Mullard for making a mockery out of the employees. While he was laying down, Joe finds the name Alex engraved on the mill, and his neighbor tells him that Alex was the only employee who managed to make it out. Suddenly, the daily quota changes from 50 rotations to 370, and he is left with no choice but to meet the new quota even though he's exhausted from the previous day. As he begins pushing the mill, he notices that the scoreboard is not really changing. His neighbor explains that Joe has a penalty, which means that he needs to push the mill twice as many times to meet the minimum quota. At the end of the day, Joe, exhausted, gives up, and the automated voice claims that he'd lost to meet the quota. And because of this, they will offer his wife a job at Mullard. Joe begs Mullard not to do anything to Kate as she cannot be on her feet as per her doctor's orders, and motivated more than ever, he pushes the mill and achieves the quota of the day. The next day, he wakes up to see a video of Kate, who's in the hospital with their child. Although he was happy about Kate giving birth safely, he feels sad to be missing on such a big moment in his life. When his neighbor hears about the birth of his son, he tells Joe that Alex had escaped through a hole that he had dug. Joe uses the pen that he'd received and starts digging in the same spot, hidden from the cameras. He manages to dig a hole and finds out that Mullard has only patched it up. This means that he can crawl out of it, but his plans come to an end as a guard catches him and takes him back to the mill. As punishment, Joe needed to complete 1,000 rotations to meet his daily quota. He refuses to do this and figures out that the whole place is run by algorithms that he has created. This means that if everyone refuses to push the mill, there will be no terminations as everyone's score will be 0 for that day. At first, the employees were hesitant, but Joe manages to convince them not to work for the day. But as the day ends, the automated voice announces that anyone with 0 points will be terminated. And feeling scared, everyone starts pushing the mill again. As the timer was about to run out, his neighbor reveals that his leg is injured and that he's not able to work. He tells Joe to score a point and not to worry about him, and at the last moment, Joe scores 1 point before the workday ends. His neighbor knows that he's about to die and confesses that he is Alex. He too had been caught after his escape attempt and had been placed in a separate cell. The only reason he had continued to help Joe was because he hoped that the second attempt might end up being successful. Sometime later, Joe falls asleep but hears the anguished cries of Alex as he is terminated. The next day begins as usual, and Joe doesn't really feel motivated to push the mill anymore. The automated voice then tells Joe that Millard is going to show him a video to help him stay focused on his goal of being a good worker. And then a video of Kate begins to play with their now grown child who's able to walk. Joe realizes that he's missed several years of his child life as days have become blurred for him and he has no idea how long he's been trapped in the mill. This video was the last straw for Joe and he starts to scream in anguish. He says that Mullard has taken everything away from him despite dedicating 10 years of his life to the company. Once he stops screaming, the automated voice starts talking again and claims that Joe is no longer fit for Mullard's culture and his services are no longer needed. And this is why he'll be getting terminated, and just then, several men and women enter his room and surround him. Joe tries to talk to them, but they don't seem to be registering anything that he was saying, almost as if they were robots. Soon, a guard enters the room as well, carrying a lethal injection on a tray to terminate him, and the guard starts talking and says that Joe's performance has been disappointing. He even claims that after Joe's death, he'll go after Kate. And hearing this, Joe rushes forward and starts punching him until the guard starts to bleed. Behind him, the automated voice once again begins to talk and says that the guard has failed to accomplish his task and now Joe needs to terminate him. This announcement helps Joe come back to reality and he sees the damage that he had done. Joe backs away and starts shouting again, saying that he will not bend to Mullard's rule because he is not a murderer like them. He claims that he's quitting his job, and as soon as he says this, Joe opens his eyes and finds himself inside a room and Mullard surrounded by his coworkers. In front of him was a guard who welcomes him back to reality. Seeing Joe's confused state, he explains that his name is Johnny, and Joe has just experienced Mullard's advanced career training simulation. Johnny also assures Joe that it has not been years, but rather only 60 minutes have gone by. Since Joe had been stuck at level 8 of management, he had chosen to take part in this simulation. His performance in the simulation resulted in him getting promoted to level 9 management, and he is then taken to his new office, but Joe has a hard time moving past the simulation as it was still haunting him. He is given a contract that he signs and calls his wife, and he tells Kate that he's gonna be late, and as he hangs up, he claims that he's going to burn Mullard down. And with that last line, the movie comes to an end.